This is the closest to an authentic Andre 3000 wardrobe I could assemble, given the wardrobe at my disposal. Or hold on. There we go. This is as authentic as it gets. You ever heard that one viral song and thought, hey, I kinda like that, and then went on with your day and didn't think about it anymore? Well, that was pretty much me with Hey Ya for 10 years. I thought it sounded super unique, mind you. It sounded like a combination of a million different genres, and the hook stayed stuck in my head for God knows how long, but I didn't take a deeper look into OutKast's discography until, one day, out of the blue, a friend recommended to me that I listen to the album Stankonia. Why, what's a Stankonia? The proverbial me asked myself, and out of curiosity I gave the album a listen. I assumed from the cover that this would be some kind of political, anti-establishment R&B album, but man, this album is so much more. It's also kind of that, but it's also so much more. OutKast is a hip-hop duo comprised of Andre Benjamin, otherwise known as Dre 3 Stacks, and of course, Andre Ice Cold 3000. And Antoine Patton, otherwise known as Daddy Fat Stacks, Sir Lucius Left Foot, and most prominently, Big Boy. The group was formed in 1992 when they were both still in school, and it was shortly after graduating that they secured a record deal. Today, OutKast is one of the most critically lauded duos in recent musical history. Big Boy still makes music, and Andre owns a really big flute, so clearly they're both doing pretty well for themselves. But of course, the question remains. Which of their 6, debatably 7, studio albums is the very best? To answer this burning question, today we are going to rank every OutKast album from worst to best. Bombs away. So, we begin at the end. How poetic. This is OutKast's 6th, debatably 7th, studio album, released in 2006, titled Idlewild. While it's true that the group's last album was their worst, that in no way indicates that the duo went out with a whimper. Idlewild is the only OutKast album to have come out with an accompanying movie. Idlewild the movie tells the tale of a fictitious juke bar in the year 1935, run by Big Boy with Andre as the main piano player. In the movie, the two characters were once close friends, but slowly began to drift apart from each other. I hope they were aware of the irony of that. It's a fun movie. Not exactly a great movie, but enjoyable for what it is. Would be more enjoyable, though, if it had more OutKast music in it, because for a musical, the song numbers are pretty few and far between. And on that note, when there actually are songs, half of them are taken from Speakerboxxx or The Love Below. Only 6 songs from the 25-track album actually make an appearance in the film, meaning that the album is more of a standalone work than a soundtrack to this film. There are definite highlights from this record, like Mighty O, Into You, Morris Brown, Hollywood Divorce, and In Your Dreams. Some of the songs on here feature very emotional retrospective lyrics looking back on OutKast's run, like The Train.
Back in 94, that was a motherfucking year, homeboy. Then that other player listed with platinum.
But for the most part, no real core theme or idea unites these songs. This is undoubtedly the most swing-inspired OutKast album, many of the songs replicating the juke bar vibe of the movie. The trade-off is that there's a lot more singing on this album than there is rapping, and that's where the issue is. I think that the general consensus is that the main problems with this album are a lack of rapping, especially from Andre, a lack of focus, and a general production style many may have found to be a little too weird for their tastes. I personally like the production on this album for the most part, but there are definitely some songs on here that feel surprisingly flat for OutKast. Some of the songs on here, like PJ and Rooster, are trying so hard to be conceptual that they forget to be good songs. Personally, I still like this album, but it's clear that both members of the duo were moving in very different creative directions from one another, and the resulting album feels like it doesn't know exactly what it wants to be.
What's the popular music of right now? I mean, you can't, do these huge scores of music that kids really don't get into. You have to do the music that they dig, so I guess it's our way of doing it.
My favorite song off here is In Your Dreams, though I gotta admit, even though many may call it corny, there's something I really like about Into You.
Don't want no girlfriend, just wanna get into you.
You're all I've ever wanted, but I'm terrified of you. See, my
Yes, I know that this is technically half an album, but for reasons I'm gonna get into shortly, I basically count it as its own album. The Love Below is OutKast's fifth and a half album.
After Stankonia, Andre felt that rap as a genre had worn him out. As such, he began work on a solo project that would cater more towards jazz, pop, and even electro than rap. Simply titled The Love Below, this project was originally going to be billed as a standalone Andre 3000 album. That is until at the last minute, Andre's managers convinced him to release it as an OutKast album instead. There were some evident issues with doing this, though. Since it barely featured Big Boy, it was to be conjoined with an entirely new project created by Big Boy called Speakerbox. And Speakerbox barely featured Andre, which meant that now it was fair. As a result of this, the A and B sides of this album have starkly different blood flowing through their veins. I mean, they both have different names, different covers, and are completely different styles. Ranking them as one conjoined project would somewhat impede my ability to really delve into the strengths and weaknesses of each album, respectively. So for these reasons, I'm splitting this album in two for the sake of this ranking. Like with its follow-up, Idlewild, The Love Below tones down that whole rapping thing and replaces it with singing, much to the displeasure of many OutKast fans of the day, mind you. To be honest, Andre has a set of pipes that are more than capable of singing as well as rapping. I will say, however, that Andre 3000 is known as an absolute goat when it comes to the structure of his rhymes and flows. There are entire videos on how he structured his sentences in ingenious ways that allowed for more rhymes and double entendres than almost any other MC of his time, with a few exceptions, of course. So when listening to an album like The Love Below, which features a greatly diminished amount of rapping, it just feels like Andre isn't really playing to his strengths. Kinda, because these songs are honestly still well written enough that they're enjoyable to listen to, even without rapping. This is also where Andre really veered into sonic experimentation. Look no further than the wacky chord progressions of Spread or the reversed percussion on Vibrate. The tracklist also presents us with some of OutKast's all-time biggest hits like Roses and the aforementioned Hey Ya, which marked a completely new creative direction for OutKast, and was assembled from the first 4 guitar chords Andre ever learned how to play. But hey, ya, it still worked. And these lyrics have 10 times more substance than 99% of pop songs, questioning if our cultural fixation with the idea that love is forever is actually just artificial and indicative of our insecurities.
Nothing is forever. Then what makes it? 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 Love the exception.
There are plenty of treats to be found on The Love Below, but not everything on here is exactly gold. There's like a 5-minute John Coltrane sample with drums added that doesn't really go anywhere. And this album also has some of my all-time least favorite OutKast songs on it, like Pink and Blue or Love and War, a song that is remarkably void of anything meaningful to say on the topic of love or war. And the chorus on here, I hate to say this about an OutKast song, but it just downright sucks.
Let's kiss, not fight. Try to do what's right tonight. Make love, not war.
So even though this record has some exceptionally high peaks, it also suffers from some fairly low valleys. Whilst I love songs like Spread, I think my favorite track on here is still Hey Ya, possibly for nostalgia-based reasons, shut up. Talk shit all you want that I'm a normie, but if not for this song, we wouldn't know what's cooler than being cool, i.e. ice cold. Alright, 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 alright.
Let's move all the way back to 1994, shortly after the release of Players Ball, OutKast's first album, Southern Playlist of Cadillac Music.
Listening to this project immediately after Idlewild and The Love Below really makes one appreciate how much the duo developed their sound over the course of their career. On top of having, well, vastly more actual rapping on it than The Love Below, Southern is also centered around the funky soul-inspired sound that defined much of 90s hip-hop, except that Dre and Big Boy graced the sound with their own personalized magic touch, creating an album that sounded exceptionally polished despite the fact that they were mere teenagers upon its release. Sonically, this album has its fair share of weirdness that define the duo's sound.
Ain't no thing but a chicken wing.
As you may have guessed, this album also sounds very Southern, especially with all those soulful guitar licks. But to truly understand the significance of this album, one must place themselves into the mentality of 1994, when rap was undergoing a massive transition period. The early, more edgy days of rap defined by artists like NWA were nearing their end, as the more artistically inclined era of Nas or A Tribe Called Quest was just beginning. This album finds itself as one of the forefathers of rap's second wave. Lyrically, this album focuses primarily on two specific things: life in the South and the idea of being an outcast. Considering this duo is called OutKast, this album really lives up to that name more so than any other album by them.
You got songs like Call of the Wild asking what causes people to turn to crime, as well as songs like Get Up, Get Out, which are borderline motivational songs telling you to actually do something productive with your life.
And then you got the album's seminal hit, Players Ball, which talks about how, in the southern backstreets, there isn't really such a thing as Christmas, just an endless hustle.
So I begin to piece my 2 and 2 together. Got no snowy weather, have to find something to do better. Bet ain't no chimneys in the ghetto, so I won't be hanging my socks on no chip.
This album went platinum and instantly propelled OutKast into the public limelight. Though not all the attention was positive. When the duo accepted a Source Award for this album, they got booed hard.
Yeah.
The South just wasn't taken seriously as a hotspot for music at this time. All eyes were on the conflict between the East Coast and the West Coast. And neither coast wanted an entirely new area to have to compete with, so the idea of music coming from the South was just kind of a meme.
Closed-minded folks, you know what I'm saying? It's like, this the South got something to say, that's all I got to say.
But despite all them fucking haters, this album still soars and provides a listener with a handful of timeless songs and bars. However, if I'm being honest, I don't think this album is quite as stacked with great songs as the average OutKast album. It's an admirable debut, but the group were still figuring out how to push boundaries experimentally and sonically, something I think they did better later on. As you can probably tell, I like this album, as I like all OutKast albums, even Idlewild, which makes ranking them not easy. But yeah, you gotta do what you gotta do. I think ethereal tracks like Crumblin' Herb or the title track deserve admiration, but in my opinion, the best song on here is also the biggest hit, Players Ball.
And if you like fish and grits and all that pimp shit, everybody let me hear you say, oh yeah, girl. Now throw your hands in the air.
Perhaps the only true authentic way to listen to this album is while cruising around in a Cadillac in the ATL, which I've never done. So forgive me for not consuming this album under the proper circumstances. I did the best that I could. ATLiens is OutKast's second studio album.
Coming off the raging popularity of Southern, the pressure was on for these two dope boys in a Cadillac to follow it up with an equally successful record. The only problem was that these two dope boys in question didn't want to do the exact same thing that they had already done. As I mentioned, their first album had found itself released in the middle of a transitional period in rap music. 2 years later, in '96, the rap scene had clearly changed. Albums like The Score by Fugees, which put much more emphasis on virtuosity and a gentle laid-back sound, dropped that same year. Furthermore, Andre and Antoine had undergone significant changes in their personal lives that further spurred on the new sound on display in their sophomore record. Antoine had become a father and lost his aunt, who for all intensive purposes had served as his mother figure. Andre, meanwhile, had undergone a bit of a personality shift in the wake of being smacked in the face with fame at the ripe old age of 19. He'd become more confident and flamboyant, dropped his phony gangster persona, and had given up on smoking weed. You wouldn't think that, though, considering that ATLiens is pretty much as stoner-friendly as an album can get. Everything on here sounds spacey and vibey. The beats are far more chilled and laid back than the ones on Southern. Everything sounds far more, dare I say, alien this time around. I mean, what makes you more of an outcast than literally being an alien? I don't know. Liking the Star Wars prequels, maybe? Such as I? The lyrics are more focused on the personal lives of the duo this time around, as opposed to life in general in the South. From two dope boys in a Cadillac to Elevators to Babylon, where Big Boy unloads the grief he's been carrying around in the wake of losing his aunt.
People don't know the stress I'm dealing with day to day. Speaking about the feelings I'm possessing for Renee.
This album gets much more personal than Southern ever did. And that's not to say that Southern didn't ever get personal or that it never delved into the psyches of the duo, but ATLiens pushes those ideas much further further and yields a greater emotional resonance as such. However, to play devil's advocate for a minute here, one could argue that some of the lyrics on here are a tad antiquated, and some of the features on here are pretty weak, like Timo on Mainstream. But what some bars may lack, Andre and Big Boy more than make up for. Though there is that one unfortunate homophobic line from Big Rube on 13th Floor. OutKast almost managed to be one of the only 90s rap outfits to escape having that kind of stuff in their lyrics, but what can you do? I'm a big fan of how this record ties Andre and Antoine's personal lives, especially in the wake of their newfound fame, to the idea of being some kind of alien, gawked at by the rest of society. Also, I gotta mention that the hooks on this album are top-notch. From Wheels of Steel to the title track, ATLiens.
Now throw your hands in the air and wave them like you just don't care.
Prepare to have these songs stuck in your head, because they're gonna get stuck in your head. A lot of the hooks are just harmonic humming, and yet it still suits the laid-back tone of the record perfectly. This album was clearly a step in the right direction from the duo, and it is an undisputed classic. It's a shame there's still 3 albums I consider better, because I would have loved to rank this higher. I'd say my favorite track on here is the title track.
Here is the other half of Speaker Love, Speaker Box. Speaker Box. OutKast's 5th album. This placement was a tough call, and I know many people will vehemently disagree with it. Can't be worse than the reception of my Kanye video, though. But to be fair, even I don't agree with that fucking video anymore.
I'm seriously torn about putting this project above Southern and ATLiens. On the one hand, ATLiens is an undisputed classic which actually features both members of OutKast to a roughly equal extent. But on the other hand, Speakerbox is the album that made me fall in love with OutKast. Yes, Speakerbox, not Stankonia. As I said, it was Stankonia that made me want to listen to the rest of the duo's work, but it was Speakerbox and The Love Below that I actually got initially hooked on, and it was the constant rotation of these songs that made me fall in love with the group. That doesn't mean it's currently my favorite OutKast album, but it was early on, and for that reason, it still holds a special place in my heart. This album is the yin to The Love Below's yang. Whereas The Love Below is electronic, poppy, and jazzy, Speakerbox is retro, P-Funk inspired, and plays more into OutKast's typical southern rap style. There is one major commonality between both discs of this project, however, that being that they are both wildly eccentric, as OutKast should be. Now, Big Boy had delivered many top-of-the-line bars on prior outings, but it was with Speakerbox that the spotlight was finally his. And by God, he made the most of it. I think it's not uncommon that Andre 3000 overshadows Big Boy where OutKast's legacy is concerned. I understand that Andre contributed hugely to the development of more complex flows within the rap scene, but that doesn't mean that you should ever underestimate Big Boy. Antoine was still leagues ahead of the average MC of his time. He's one half of the duo after all, and without him, there would be no OutKast in the first place. Speakerbox is probably one of the most varied stretches of songs in OutKast's catalog, not unlike The Love Below, except that everything comes together a little more nicely here than it does on Andre's disc. The first full-length song on the record is Ghetto Music, the only song that prominently features Andre. This song is a bop, and one of OutKast's most catchy hooks and inventive beat switches in their entire catalog. The next 3 tracks are back-to-back gold, those being Unhappy, Bowtie, and The Way You Move, in which Big Boy perfects his take on pop. After track 5, I don't think the album ever quite recaptures the sheer quality of these intro songs, but it's still a damn solid listen. 3 of the tracks on here are produced by Andre: Ghetto Music, Church, and Last Call, and You Can Tell. These tracks have a more experimental edge to them than most of the record.
Sometimes life can keep me down with the face all in the dirt. If you feel that left behind, need to get up and go to church.
But I think they still fit in and complement the rest of the album well. Speakerbox is also littered with features: Killer Mike, CeeLo Green, and Jay-Z, just to name a few. Such as on an album like My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, I think the features add a sense of grandeur to the album without distracting from the main attraction. I don't think every track on here is born equal, but nothing on here is bad or even close to being bad in my eyes. I understand how the lack of Andre would turn many off, and I agree it would be even better if he actually had verses on here. here. But still, just viewing it as an album objectively, I think it's fantastic. Best track to me is Unhappy, a melancholy song about living in the face of inescapable depression and unfulfillment that deceives you with an upbeat melody, not unlike Hey Ya.
And here is Aquemini, OutKast's third album, and also the album that everyone who ever makes a list ranking OutKast albums puts at number 1. Except for Anthony Fantano, because he's cool like me.
Released 2 years after ATLiens, Aquemini is considered by some to be one of the first and one of the best concept albums in hip-hop. The name, Aquemini, is the result of combining Big Boi's astrological symbol, Aquarius, with Andre's, Gemini. Aquemini. And the name is fitting indeed, because I think this album is when the two really link up creatively better than on any other project of theirs. They were experimenting and pushing themselves more than ever.
Well, Aquemini was actually like a blending of both of the signs, the Aquarius and the Gemini, like letting people know that like two totally different worlds can come together and make this music. Dre is totally different from Big Boi. Big Boi is totally different from Dre. How can they stay together and do this music? I mean, but you got to think, man. I mean, what make Kool-Aid so good? You know what I'm saying? It's like you got the packet that's sour as hell. You know what I'm saying? Then you got that sweet sugar, and it's totally opposite. But hey, when you put it together, hey, it be on.
If it weren't for them,
the game wouldn't be the same.
The two were trying different things from one another, but they weren't veering off in two completely different creative directions yet. There was still a middle ground allowing for an interesting duality between their two respective styles. Now, all that preamble isn't to say that this is my absolute favorite OutKast album in terms of sheer quality, but what I am saying is that if it's your favorite, trust me, I get it. This album is the bomb. With 2 successful albums behind them, the duo were given practically unlimited money to create this album, and boy did they use it. Most of the songs on here are the results of long extended jam sessions that the group staged when the album was in its early development. Aquemini is lush and colorful with its production. Right off the bat, this album hits you with this heavenly sounding echoey choir laden with a playful sounding music box. And then immediately takes a left turn into the dark and intimidating sounding Return of the G. Despite this, the lyrics are actually pretty touching, exposing that Big Boi values his family more than his artificial public image. Once you keep listening, you'll encounter hit after hit. Rosa Parks, the title track, West Savannah, The Art of Storytelling, Spotty Oddie Dopalicious, Chonky Fire, this album is studded with gems. And they all sound varied in terms of their production. The bars on Aquemini are widely regarded as some of the group's best, and I don't disagree, they're great. Just a song like Rosa Parks has incredibly enjoyable lines left and right. A lot of the subject matter on here is captivating as well, like the song Synthesizer, which is about how people value artificial, synthetic lifestyles nowadays more than authentic, natural experiences. On the other hand, you also have songs that really tug at your heartstrings, like The Art of Storytelling Part 1, which tells the story of a girl Andre grew up with, who fell victim to domestic and drug abuse, eventually losing her life.
But 2 weeks later, she got found in the back of a school with a needle in her arm, baby, too much do. Sasha Thumper.
Most of the songs on here have a story to tell. It's like Aquemini takes the themes from Southern, addressing the struggles that one must face in life, and combines them with the themes from ATLiens, addressing more personal and abstract ideas. Furthermore, this album is extremely polished, it's chock full of sound effects, and serves as a masterclass in how to use samples.
Southern Playlist of Cadillac music was sample free. ATLiens, I think it had like maybe, I don't even think it did one sample on the whole album. But some people get out there and they abuse, you know what I'm saying, and use no creativity whatsoever. They might take a whole song from the beginning, 3 seconds to the ending, you know what I'm saying, 3.5 minutes, just busting all on somebody else's beat, you know what I'm saying. But what OutKast like to do is we like to do creative sampling, you know what I'm saying, that we sample a horn riff or some kind of drum kick or a snare or anything, a hat. You never know where it came from because we alter it so much.
There are laid back tracks, and then there are bops, and then there are maximalist full brass orchestra accompanied songs. This record really is the full package. This is classic OutKast at its absolute finest. For those who prefer 90s OutKast, this is as good as it gets. For me, I think there are still higher highs in the duo's catalog, but this is a high-ass high regardless. And I think the very highest high on this album is The Art of Storytelling. And remember, kids, as a wise man once said she'd lap dance on your laptop while your laptop's in your lap. Personally, I live by those words.
It's usually quite hard for me to pick the top album in any given ranking video, but this time around, the choice seemed decidedly clear. I mean, OutKast has one of the best discographies in the entirety of hip-hop, so narrowing it down to one album that's better than all the rest should have been a chore. And yet it wasn't.
I mean, sure, I flirted with the idea of putting Aquemini at number 1, and later I was vaguely considering getting real spicy with it and putting Speakerboxxx up there just to piss everyone off, but I was never actually gonna do either of those things, as neither felt right. That's because I knew in my heart of hearts from the very beginning that Stankonia belongs in that spot. Named after their recording studio of the time, Stankonia is weird, and above all else, Stankonia is not afraid to be weird. This album takes a psychedelic funk sound and mixes that with electro, and then mixes that with the classic southern rap style of OutKast to create something wild. It's quite difficult, if not impossible, to think of anything else released around this time that sounds even remotely like Stankonia. It sounds vaguely like Gorillaz, a wee little bit like Kanye, and even a tad like Kid Cudi, but all of these artists hadn't even debuted yet at the time of Stankonia. The ripple effects of this album's influences must be incalculable. Right off the bat, this album packs a punch. Listening to this is like getting a flamethrower straight into your face, except you also happen to be on magic mushrooms, so the pain is dulled and replaced with the sensation of raw energy and pure heat. The opening full-length track, Gasoline Dreams, is a critique of the corruption and imperialism within the United States government, and the track is backed by an authoritative descending electric guitar. The next track, So Fresh So Clean, is one of the more chill, vibey songs on the album. It's also one of the catchiest. I love how that synth washes over the beat, and by God, this is one of their most infectious choruses. After that, we get Miss Jackson, which many see to be the definitive OutKast song. This song blew up when it was released and propelled OutKast squarely into the mainstream. I know we're all used to it by now, but it's cool to hear the duo direct a breakup song not towards the girl being broken up with, but her mother and how that affects their relationship. Other highlight tracks on here include Spaghetti Junction, I'll Call Before I Come, We Love These Hoes, Humble Mumble, Question Mark, Red Velvet, Gangsta Shit, Slum Beautiful, and the title track, which closes out the record with a gorgeous psychedelic chorus that sounds like it's straight out of the 60s, especially with that noodling guitar in the background there. But there's one song that I think stands out from the standouts, harnessing a level of raw power humans previously did not think was possible. And that song is... This is my favorite OutKast song, and might be the best OutKast song. I mean, there's obviously a lot of competition, but Bob has a punchiness to it, accompanied by that trademark OutKast weirdness that works for me so well it makes my brain explode inside my skull every time I hear it. This whole album feels like some kind of experiment that Andre and Big Boy illegally concocted in their secret lair, which is actually just a giant greenhouse full of exotic plants. It's a fucking experience. This is such a colorful listen, it's difficult to imagine how much thought must have gone into the instrumentation of each individual song. There are also many interludes peppered throughout the record that add character. Some of them are more entertaining than others, but none of them overstay their welcome, as many skits from this time period in rap often did. Also, the lyrics on here bite.
Too democratic, Republic fucking, we chicken nugget, we dip in the sauce like mopping bucket. Blue collar scholars who take your dollar and wipe my ass with it. You're living for the lotto, never hit it.
And you can tell that Andre and Big Boy, especially Andre, had perfected their respective styles and flows at this point. Now, if you really want to be a nitpicking Nancy, I could understand the argument that Aquemini still offers up more impactful lyrical topics, but as far as I'm concerned, this album isn't trying to achieve the same kind of feeling that Aquemini was aiming for. Stankonia is meant to be far more playful and more fun. So many of the lyrics on here are creative in the most fun way, like cooler than Freddie Jackson sipping on a milkshake in a snowstorm. I love that. I've heard people argue that this is the mainstream OutKast album, and firstly, no, it's not. This is. But even if Speakerboxxx / The Love Below didn't exist, this album would still not be their most quote-unquote mainstream. It would be their most popular, sure, but it is certainly not a mainstream-sounding album. Stankonia takes all kinds of risks and isn't afraid to go one step beyond in every category. It builds on what came prior without branching away from it too much like the later albums did. It's the perfect blend of early OutKast and late OutKast.
I, very much so, love Stankonia. And I think we can pretty much leave it at that, because OutKast is one of those groups that gave us so much good material that there will never be true consensus on what their best work is. I can only imagine what the duo would have put out after Idlewild if they'd stayed together, but unfortunately Andre and Big Boy moved so far apart creatively that the idea of a collaboration now just seems out of the question. Even though they're both on good terms, don't listen to SNL, it's lying to you. So while we still get solo material from Big Boy and Donda features from Andre, we may be waiting forever for the next OutKast project. But as a wise man once said, forever never seems like a long time until you're grown. Forever ever, forever ever, forever ever.